Section 6 of Tribal Custom and Anglo-Saxon Law by Frederic Seebohm. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. The Evidence of Beowulf on Tribal Custom Regulating Feuds, etc. The object of the short study in this chapter of Beowulf is to learn what incidental information it may give of tribal usage regarding the blood feud, especially on points which, in the case of the substituted wergeld, present doubt and difficulty. Footnote. In the quotation of passages from Beowulf, I have mostly followed Professor Earle's translations. End footnote. Allusion has already been made to some of these points. Did the rule excluding galanas or blood fine within the kindred extend beyond the gweli to the greater kindred? What happened to a tribesman in a feud between his paternal and maternal kindreds? Did he abstain from taking sides? Or did a marriage so far unite two families or kindreds as to make them one for the purpose of blood fine or feud, so as to prevent the feud or blood fine from arising? These are questions upon which we want light from the point of view of Welsh tribal custom, and upon which we approach Beowulf for light, with eyes open also to other matters of tribal usage as they may turn up. Beowulf for the present purpose may be taken as an Anglian or Northumbrian recension of a story founded upon Scandinavian tradition, and designed for use or recital at some 8th century royal court, possibly, if Professor Earle's suggestion be correct, that of King Offa. The western horizon of the story extends to the Frisian shores, but the scene seems chiefly to lie in the Baltic. The plot involves tribal relations between a chieftain of the Danes, possibly of Zealand, and two Swedish chieftains. The two latter concern us most, and they seem to be the chiefs of two kindreds, Geats and Swedes, Beowulf himself being the link between them, his mother having married from one into the other kindred. This marriage, at any rate, was one between two kindreds. There is no apparent effort on the part of the poet to enlighten the reader or those who heard him, either upon the pedigrees of the persons mentioned in his story, or upon the rules of Scandinavian tribal custom. But it happens that, by incidental hints dropped in the telling of the tale, the pedigree of each of the kindreds involved can be fairly made out, and has already been made out by translators and critics. And as the story involves a homicide within Beowulf's maternal kindred, and fighting and bloodshed between the kindreds in spite of the marriage link, and as it deals also with outside feuds, it happens to present remarkable opportunities for studying the action of tribal custom in various cases. The evidence it gives is made all the more valuable by its being an Anglian version of Scandinavian traditions, inasmuch as the poet or his Anglian interpreter assumes throughout that the laws of the game under Scandinavian tribal custom were too well known to need explanation to his Anglian audience, so that by inference it would seem that the customs of Baltic chieftains were familiar at the court of Offa, and not very far removed from those of Anglian tradition. The poet introduces us first to a tribe of Gardanes in the clan or kindred of Scyldings. Skjold, the son of Shef, is the ancestor of the Scyldings. He is an Adeling who has torn their mead thrones from many tribes, or magdom, and in true tribal fashion compelled them to pay tribute. Surrounded in his old age by numerous descendants and other Geseths who have resorted to him, the chieftain has become a great hero in his tribe, or magth. A graphic description of the burial of Skjold and his ships by his Geseths is a fitting introduction to the poem. Let us mark in passing that the word magd evidently may mean a much wider kindred than the near family of a great-grandfather's descendants, that is, the Welsh gweli. One magd conquers another and makes it pay tribute. Again, the word Geseth evidently includes, with members of the near kin, such others, not necessarily blood relations, as may have joined the warrior band of the hero. They may or may not have been adopted into his kindred in becoming his men, but this extension of comradeship or kinship, as the case may be, to these Geseths add to the greatness and power of his magd. Reader's note. The text here contains a table of familial relations that reads as follows. The great-grandfather Skjold begat the grandfather Beowulf, who is not the titular Beowulf of this story. This Beowulf, the grandfather, begat the father Healfdene. Healfdene begat 4 children. The eldest was Heorogar. The second son was Hrothgar the Scylding. The youngest son was Halga. The daughter was Elan. The oldest son, Heorogar, begat a son, Heorowead. The second son, Hrothgar the Shielding, married Wealhtheow, and they begat 2 sons, Hrethrich and Hrothmund, and a daughter, Freawara. The youngest son, Halga, begat a son, Hrodulf. The daughter Elan was presumably married to Ongentheow the Shulfing. They begat Onela and Ochthera, who were thus the sons of Hrothgar's sister. Ochthera begat Eanmund and Eadgil. End of table. The opening episode of the burial of Skuld is followed by a few lines which reveal something of the pedigree of his descendant, Hrothgar the Shielding. The pedigree of Hrothgar, in true tribal fashion, makes Skuld his great-grandfather. He is Hrothgar the Shielding, may we not say, because Skuld was his great-grandfather, just as Hengist and Horsa were Oise kings according to Bede, who in stating their pedigree made Oisc their great-grandfather. And just as in the Welsh surveys, the Gwellies still bear the great-grandfather's name though he be long dead, because the Gwelly hangs together till the 4th generation. So far as it goes, here is at least an indication that the nearer kindred, or Gwelly, might be much the same thing both in Celtic and Teutonic tribes. But Hrothgar is not described only as a chieftain of his nearer kindred. Success in arms has made him head of many Winemagas, or blood friends, and he was surrounded by a mighty Magodrite, or band of kin. He had built himself a famous folkstede, or hall, called Heort, and all had gone well with him till the monster Grendel came upon the scene. The deliverer from the monster was Beowulf, the hero of the story. He comes from another kindred, that of the Schulfings, whose pedigree, not fully given, seems to have been something like the following. Schulf was the common ancestor of the Swedes or Schulfings. The tribe was divided into 2 families, in the elder of which descended the chieftainship of the Schulfings. Reader's note. Here follow in the text 2 tables laying out the relations of the 2 families, as follows. Table 1. While the links are not stated in the story, Ongentheow presumably married Elan, sister of Hrothgar the Shielding. They begat Onela and Ochthera begat Eanmund and Eadgils. Table 2. Second family of Wagmundings. Into the Gwelly of the great-grandfather Wagmund were born 2 brothers, the first being Ecgtheow, who fled to Hrothgar, and the second being Weohstan. Each of the brothers begat a son. Ecgtheow's son was Beowulf, and Weohstan's son was Wiglaf. End of tables. At any rate, the Schulfings seem to be divided into 2 families whose common ancestor was Schulf, but both Beowulf and Wiglaf are spoken of as Wagmundings. The headship of the Schulfings had passed into the older of the 2 families, and this probably is the reason why Beowulf is never called Beowulf the Schulfing. The reason why Beowulf appeared as the natural helper of Hrothgar from the monster Grendel was that his father Ecgtheow owed a debt of gratitude to Hrothgar. Quote, fighting out a mighty feud, end quote, Ecgtheow had killed Heath-Olaf the Wulfing, thereby raising another feud, wherefore his own people, fearing invasion, had caused him to flee over sea, thereby seemingly wiping their hands of him. He seems to have fled to Hrothgar, just as the latter had become chieftain of the Scyldings on his brother Heorogar's death. Hrothgar compounded the feud with money, sending to the Wulfings over sea ancient treasures, whereupon Ecgtheow swore oath to Hrothgar and presumably became his man. And Beowulf now, at honor's call, had come to fight the monster, thereby confirming the friendship between Geats and Gardanes, requiting what Hrothgar had done for his father. The details of the fight need not detain us, but the fact is important that Beowulf comes to the rescue not as a Schulfing or as representing his paternal kindred, but as the thane of his maternal uncle Hygelac, the chieftain of his mother's kindred. He approaches Hrothgar with a band of 15 chosen warriors. When asked from whence they came, they said they were Geats, Hygelac's Hearth-Geneats, and the meaning of the word is illustrated further when the warriors accustomed to sleep in Hrothgar's hall are spoken of as Hrothgar's Hearth-Geneats. When brought into the hall, Beowulf himself calls his band Hugelax Beodegeneats, or table geneats, and to Hrothgar he calls himself Mag and Magothane, literally, kin and son thane of Hugelac. The daring deed accomplished, Beowulf's success is rewarded by many golden and other gifts from Hrothgar, and it is significant that on his return he lays all these at the feet of his maternal uncle Hugelac, his Heofod Magas, or chief of kin, whose man and kin he owns himself to be. His position in Hugelac's kindred thus demands careful study. This seems to be the pedigree. Reader's note. The text here contains a table of familial relations which shows the following. Hrethel had 3 sons and 1 daughter. The eldest son was Herebeald, who was killed by the second eldest son, Hathken. The third son was Hugelac. There is 1 sister, who is Beowulf's mother. The third son, Hugelac, married Hugd. They begat 2 children. The first was a daughter who married Eofor. The second, Hugelac's only son, was Heardred. As stated before, Beowulf was the son of Hugelac's sister. End of table. Beowulf is made to say that, when 7 winters old, Hrethel had received him from his father Ecgtheow and had kept him as his own child. Remembering kinship, or Sippegamunda, the old chieftain held him in no less regard than his own 3 sons, Herebeald, Hathken, and Hugelac. But Hrethel's old age was full of trouble. The worst tragedy that came upon him was the death of his eldest son Herebeald, killed by his second son, apparently by accident. Quote, Hathken by arrow from hornbow brought him, or Herebeald, down, his near kinsman. He missed the target and shot his brother. End quote. Here, then, was an apparently accidental homicide within the family. How was it regarded? Quote, 1 brother killed the other with bloody dart. That was a wrong past compensation. Any way and every way, it was inevitable that the Etheling must quit life unavenged. End quote. The poet likens the father's grief to that of an old churl who should see his young son ride on the gallows tree and could do nothing but wait while his son thus hangs, food for the ravens, as he cannot bring him help. Quote, So did the crowned chief of the storm folk, in memory of Herebeald, carry about a tumult of heart sorrow. He could not possibly requite the feud upon the manslayer, never the more could he pursue the warrior with hostile deeds, though not beloved by him. He then, with the sorrow wherewith that wound had stricken him, let go life's joys and chose the light of God. End quote. Thus, incidentally, is revealed by the poet the depth of the tribal feeling that homicide can only be atoned for by avengement and feud, making it a hard struggle against nature for a father to withhold revenge upon a son for even accidental fratricide. As with the Cymry, it seems that there could be no feud or composition within the family. Nor in the case of accidental homicide was there apparently in the poet's mind the necessity of flight or outlawry, however great the craving for avengement. It is also significant that Hathken, the slayer, is made to join with his brother Hugelac in the next warfare after Hrethel's death. The accidental slayer remains a tribesman. This next warfare was a quarrel, provocation and reprisal, between Swedes and Geats, i.e., between the paternal and maternal kindreds of Beowulf. He himself, it is worth noting, did not engage in it. Onela and Ochfere, the sons of Ongentheow, Beowulf's paternal relation and chief of the Scholfings, or Swedes, apparently began the quarrel. They recklessly broke the peace between the 2 families, Swedes and Geats. Hrethel was no longer living. Beowulf's maternal uncles, Hathken and Hugelac, fought on one side and Ongentheow and his 2 sons on the other. Hathken fell on one side and Ongentheow on the other, the latter by the hand of Eofor, a comrade rather than kinsman of Hugelac, for he was rewarded by the bestowal of Hugelac's daughter. The quarrel seems to have been open fighting, possibly from the revival of the old enmities and in breach of tribal custom. Be this as it may, Beowulf himself took no part in the quarrel between his maternal and paternal kindreds. This disastrous and unnatural quarrel left Hugelac the only surviving son of Hrethel, and so the chieftain of Beowulf's maternal kindred. All this irregular fighting, incidentally mentioned by the poet, was past before Beowulf's great enterprise against the monster Grendel, and as we have seen, it was as the man and kin of Hugelac that Beowulf appeared at Hrothgar's court, and it was at the feet of Hugelac as his chief of kin, and at the feet of Hugd, his queen, that Beowulf laid down his treasures on his return in safety. This exploit ended, Hrothgar thenceforth disappears from the poem, and the poet confines himself to Beowulf's nearer belongings. The next event in order of date is a quarrel between Hugelac and the Frisians. This time Beowulf fights for his chieftain, but Hugelac is killed, and again the result reveals interesting traits of tribal custom. Beowulf returns from Friesland to Hugd, the widowed queen of Hugelac. She, quote, offers him rings and throne, not daring to trust that her young son Heardred would be able to maintain the chieftainship against all stranger folk. End quote. Beowulf, however, declines to become Hlafurt over Heardred, but supports him in his chieftainship till he should be older. Young Heardred, however, is not chieftain long. The old lawless quarrel between Beowulf's maternal and paternal relations rises up again. The facts, when unraveled, seem to be these. Within Beowulf's paternal kindred trouble had arisen. For some cause not told, the grandsons of Ongentheow, that is, the sons of Ochthere, had been outlawed. They are described as Hlakmegas, and as having cast off allegiance to the chieftain of the Scylfings. These outlawed kinsmen of Beowulf's paternal family came to young Heardred's court, and whilst his guests, Old English on feorme, the young chieftain fell by the sword of one of them. It was Eanmund by whom this outrage was committed, and once more the crime remained apparently unavenged. The slayer was allowed to withdraw in safety, leaving Beowulf to succeed to the chieftainship of his maternal kindred. Again, we ask why. Here was a crime committed by an outlawed paternal kinsman of Beowulf against the chieftain of his maternal kindred, of whom he was himself the guardian, and yet Beowulf did not avenge it. Was it because of the kinship, or because of the outlawry? Whilst nursing the remembrance of his chieftain's death, Beowulf is made to act with kindness to the other outlawed brother in his desolation, waiting for such avengement as might come at last in the course of things, as it did according to the poet when, quote, with a band of warriors over sea, Eadgils died in cold and painful marches. End quote. Avengement is made to follow too in the same way upon Eanmund the murderer. It came from Beowulf's paternal uncle, Weohstan, but here again the poet is careful to record that it came not in a blood feud, but in fair fight with weapon's edge, and, as if to emphasize the fact that the outlawed kinsman had forfeited all tribal rights, the poet adds that Weohstan from his kindred carried off the armor and sword of Eanmund, Onela, who was Eanmund's uncle, yielding them up to him without a word about a feud, although he, that is, Weohstan, had slain his brother's son. Evidently, the poet means to make it clear that Onela's passive attitude was due to the fact that his nephew was a lawless exile, and so no longer entitled to his protection from his kin. Quote, the old sword known among men as the relic of Eanmund, son of Ochthere, whom, when a lawless exile, Weohstan had slain in fair fight with weapon's edge, and from his kindred, or magum, had carried off the brown-mottled helmet, ringed byrnie, and old mysterious sword, which Onela yielded up to him, his nephew's war-harness, accoutrement complete. Not a word spake Onela about the feud, although Weohstan had killed his brother's son. Weohstan retained the spoils for many a year, bill and byrnie, until when his own boy, Wiglaf, was able to claim earlship rank, like his father before him, then gave he to him, before the Geats, armor untold of every sort, after which he gave up life, ripe for the parting journey. End quote. Thus, the restrained desire of avengement incidentally is made to find satisfaction at last as regards both the outlawed sons of Ochthere. After these events, the elder branch of the Scyldings passes out of the poet's interest. The only remaining heroes of the tale are the two Wagmundings, Beowulf and Wiglaf. A long interval had elapsed between Beowulf's succession to the chieftainship of his maternal kindred and the final feat of daring which cost him his life, and it was Wiglaf, his nearest paternal kinsman, who in the last tragedy came to his aid bearing the sword of the outlawed Eanmund. Beowulf's dying words to Wiglaf were, "Thou art the last left of our kindred, or Kunis, the Wagmundings. Fate has swept into eternity all my kinsmen, or Magas, earls among men. I must after them." As he comes to the rescue, Wiglaf remembers the honor done to him by Beowulf, who had already passed on to him the hereditary right of the chieftainship of the Wagmundings. Why had he done this? If we might tentatively use the clue given by ancient Greek tribal custom to elucidate a Scandinavian case, we should say that on failure of male succession, the sister's son of Hugelac had been called back into his mother's kindred to become its chieftain, leaving Wiglaf, his next of kin on his father's side, to sustain the chieftainship of his paternal kindred. The right of the maternal uncle, known to have existed under early Greek law, to claim his sister's son, if need arose, to perpetuate the mother's paternal kindred, suggests a similar explanation in Beowulf's case. Such a right, found as well in the laws of Manu, may possibly have been inherent in Scandinavian tribal custom also. Such a suggestion would be at least consistent with the fact of Beowulf's having been brought up from 7 years old in the household of his maternal grandfather, and treated by him as a son. It would be in harmony, too, with what Tacitus describes to have been the relation of the sister's son to the avunculus amongst the German tribes, and the peculiar value of the sister's son as a hostage. Some indirect confirmation of the probable truth of such a suggestion may perhaps be also drawn from the fact that in Beowulf, when a man's father is no longer living, the poet sometimes seems to describe him as his maternal uncle's nephew instead of his father's son. Heardred, the young son of Hugelac and Hugd his queen, after his father's death is spoken of no longer as Hugelac's son, but as the nephew of Heredich, Nefan Herediches. Now his paternal uncles were Herebeald and Hathken, and it becomes an almost necessary inference that Hererich was a maternal uncle. Footnote: Nefan cannot mean son or grandson, for Hugelac was his father, and his grandfather was Hrethel. End footnote. Reader's note. Here the text contains a table of familial relations which reads as follows. Haereth was the father of Hugd, who married Hugelac. Their son Heardred was thus the nephew of Hugd's presumed brother, Hererich. End table. So also in the case of Hugelac himself. He was the son of Hrethel. The poet calls him son of Hrethel, and again Hugelac Hrethling. But after Hrethel's death he calls him Hugelac of the Geats, nephew of Swerting. In Old English, Hugelac Geata Nefa Swertinges. Here again it seems likely that Swerting was the maternal uncle, though the poet, as in the other case, does not think it needful to explain that it was so. Otherwise, why the change of epithet? We are here recording tribal customs as revealed in Beowulf, and not seeking for the origin and earlier stages of tribal life. We pass on, therefore, to consider what light the story throws on the custom of the northern tribes as to marriage. It is with the chieftain's grade of rank that we have mostly to do in Beowulf, and nothing is more strongly emphasized by the poet than the important place of marriage between two tribes or kindreds as a link, recognized, however, to be a very brittle one, binding them together so as to end or prevent the recurrence of a feud. When Beowulf, after his first exploit in aid of Hrothgar against Grendel, has returned to his maternal uncle and chief of kindred, Hugelac, and is recounting his adventures, the poet at the first mention of Hrothgar's queen makes him call her the peace bond to the people. And in the same breath, in telling how in Hrothgar's hall the daughter Freyawara bore the ale flagon, he stops to tell how that, quote, she, the young, the gold dight, was promised to the gay son of Froda, it having pleased the friend of the Schulfings that he, through that woman, should compose deadly enmities and feuds. End quote. And the poet makes Beowulf moralize to the effect, quote, often and not seldom anywhere after deadly strife, it is but a little while that the baneful spear reposes, good though the bride may be. End quote. It would seem that Hrothgar had been formerly at feud with the Heothbeards, that Frode had been killed in the feud, and that the marriage of Freywara to Frode's son, Ingeld, was to close the feud. But Beowulf repeats aside to Hugelac that he does not think much of the chances of a long continuance of peace between Scyldings and Heothbeards. Quote, "Well may it mislike the ruler of the Heothbeards and every thane of that people when the lady goeth into hall with the prince born of Danes amidst the high company. Upon him do glisten heirlooms of their ancestors, ringed harness, once Heathobeardic treasure, while they could keep the mastery of those weapons, and until they in an unlucky moment led to that buckler, play their dear comrades in their own lives. Then saith one over the bier, one who observes them both, an old lance-fighter, inner quote, Canst thou, my friend, recognize the blade, the precious steel, which thy father carried into battle, wearing his helmet for the last time where the Danes slew him? And the masters of the battlefield were the fiery Scyldings. Now here a boy of one of those banesmen walketh our hall, wearing the treasure which by right should have been thine." End inner quote. So urged and egged on at every turn with galling words, at last the moment comes that for his father's deeds the lady's thane sleepeth blood-spattered after the falchion's bite, life-doomed. The other escapes alive. By and by the sworn oaths of the warriors on either side will be broken, when in Ingeld's mind rankle war purposes, and care has lessened his domestic sorrow. Therefore I deem not the loyalty of the Heothbeards, nor the alliance with the Danes secure, or the friendship firm." End quote. What a consistent light this passage throws incidentally on the quarrels which, in spite of the Geats and Swedes being bound together in friendship by the marriage of Beowulf's mother, broke out again and again, according to the poem, between the two kindreds, quarrels in which Beowulf himself is represented as taking no part, presumably because, according to tribal custom, his blood relationship to both kindreds was a bar to his taking up the feud or assuming the part of the avenger. And how the whole story of Beowulf's paternal kindred reveals the melancholy fact that, however great the force of tribal custom in controlling feuds, the wild human nature of hot-blooded tribesmen was wont to break through restraints, and often ended in the outlawry of tribesmen and the breaking up of kindreds. To sum up the results obtained from the study of tribal custom as incidentally revealed in Beowulf, 1. There is no feud within the kindred when one kinsman slays another. However strong the natural instinct for avengement, it must be left to fate and natural causes. Accidental homicide does not seem to be followed even by exile, but murder within the kindred breaks the tribal tie and is followed by outlawry. 2. Marriage between two kindreds is a common though precarious means of closing feuds between them. The son of such a marriage takes no part in a quarrel between his paternal and maternal relations. 3. When a marriage takes place, the wife does not pass entirely out of her own kindred into her husband's. Her own kindred, her fathers and brothers, maintain a sort of guardianship over her, and the son, in some sense, belongs to both kindreds. He may have to join in his maternal kindred's feuds, and he may become the chieftain of his maternal kindred on failure of direct male succession, even though by so doing he may have to relinquish the right of chieftainship in his paternal kindred to another kinsman. Finally, in passing from the blood feuds to the compositions substituted for them, after what we have learned from Beowulf of tribal custom, there need be no surprise that maternal as well as paternal relations are found to be interested in them. We may fairly judge the tribal custom, in the stage in which we find it in Beowulf and later in the laws of various tribes, would not have been true to itself had this been otherwise. End of section 6.